Okay, welcome and thank you for joining us today for our Future for Developers webinar. I'm Russell Grange, I'm Director of Property for Purcell Voluntary Housing Association, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar and the Q&A that we'll be holding at the end. Purcell Housing Association has been a leading provider of social housing in Ireland since 2006 and now owns and manages circa 2,700 homes nationally. We operate in 15 local authority areas across Ireland, and we currently employ 60 staff in the delivery of all of our services. We have an ambitious growth programme in response to the need for more housing, and we continue to seek new partners in the delivery of both social and affordable housing in the locations that we currently operate in. Our vision is to make a difference by providing quality housing to those in housing need. Today's webinar is focused on property market insights and the future of planning and development management in Ireland, and I'm very pleased to be able to welcome our two guest speakers for today's webinar. Our first speaker is Stephen Purcell, who is Director and Co-Head of KPMG Future Analytics. Stephen is a chartered surveyor and urban planner with 17 years post-qualification experience. Stephen is co-head of KPMG Future Analytics following the acquisition of his business, Future Analytics Consulting Limited, by KPMG in Ireland in 2020. Stephen brings a dynamic combination of spatial planning knowledge, data-led research experience, and engagement and facilitation experience. Stephen has coordinated multidisciplinary property development teams, pan-European consortia, and project managed strategies, feasibility studies, asset management portfolios, and major residential and mixed consenting projects, including EIA coordination. Research led by Stephen has been recognised by the Irish Planning Institute National Planning Awards for a project on behalf of the Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland, and his team in Future Analytics have twice been recipients of the Champions of European Research Awards and Enterprise Ireland. Our second speaker today is Ronan Lyons, who's Associate Professor in Economics at Trinity College Dublin. Ronan is particularly interested in long-run housing markets in order to better understand current housing experiences, such as rapidly increasing housing costs in many high-income cities and in Ireland's path to economic development. Ronan is also a research associate at the Spatial Economics Research Centre in LSE and Economist for daft.ie, Ireland's largest retail estate listings website. Through this latter role, Ronan is the author of the quarterly daft.ie reports on Ireland's sale and rental housing markets. So before we get started, just to let you know, there will be obviously a Q&A at the end of this session with both of our guest speakers. We ask that should you want to ask a question of either of our guest speakers today, please place your questions in the comments section during the presentations, which will be able to be seen by our panelists ahead of the Q&A. And then obviously I'll present those questions to our guest speakers at the Q&A, which will be held at the end of the presentations. So once again, I'd like to thank and welcome our two guest speakers, and firstly, Stephen Purcell from KPMG Future Analytics.
Good morning all, just checking I can be heard loud and clear. All good. Lovely to see you all today. My name is Stephen Purcell. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm co-head of KPMG Future Analytics, and as Russell mentioned, my background in strategic regional and urban planning. I wanted to spend, and the good news that you only have to listen to me for about 15 minutes before we get to the important stuff with Ronan Lyons, but I wanted to just spend my presentation running through some of the key emerging changes in the planning and development management system in Ireland. And I was reflecting on this earlier in the week. We just hit our second anniversary within KPMG, and the level of change that has gone on that we've all experienced in the industry, and the anticipated changes that will come through in the coming period is quite significant. I just want to touch on some of those at today's presentation. So in brief, we'll touch on the strategic housing development experiences of recent years, and obviously the ratcheting up into the large-scale residential development process for consenting of larger schemes. We'll touch on the residential zone land tax, which is currently out for public consultation and display of draft maps. The anticipated urban development zones and land value sharing, which currently running through pre-legislative scrutiny and so on. Sustainable and compact settlement guidelines, which are anticipated to be released for consultation in the near term. And then this topic around tiered approach to zoning, it's not immediately new. It's something that featured obviously within the national planning framework, but has come front and center, obviously, based on some of those preceding topics. I'll then just touch lightly on some of the development plan evolution and local area plans, including housing need and demand assessment, which is the whole HNDA space has been much debated, with some closing comments on potential direction with regard to public consultation in the engagement cycle within consenting projects, and indeed, and perhaps particularly pertinent with COP27 and so on, consideration around climate action. So on the first topic, from SHD to LRD, I think, you know, there'll be a wide grouping across industry on this morning's webinar, but in brief, essentially, we have now entered a period where absolutely there's a whole series of strategic housing applications due for decision. Obvious delays have been widely publicized, and indeed a whole series of SHD consents which are being challenged in the courts. The decision-making process through the large-scale residential development scheme, as we know, will return in the first instance to the planning authority. So a full cycle of pre-planning engagement, receiving of an opinion from the planning authority with regard to the sufficiency of the materials to be adequate for making an application, it being lodged to the planning authority, adjudicated by them. Optionality around further information we'll touch on in a moment, but a return to the tradition of being able to be subject to appeal to An Bord Pleanála. As far as the definition for the large-scale residential development goes, largely the same as strategic housing, some notable differences with regard to non-residential floor area from 15 to 30%, and the combination of mixed developments where student accommodation and traditional housing features. Quite important that the material contravention provisions that would have become established and indeed have been undermined through the SHD process are no longer available in that form. So that the traditional material contravention options, which are currently being revisited in a wider review of planning activity, are what remains. We have found mapping out even the timeframes for some of the consents, which I'll come to in a moment, that you could look at anything from 60 to 100 plus weeks in terms of the process from start to finish of that cycle, just from preparation through to the final consent. Before I get to those points, though, the decision from the planning authority with regard to the outcome, obviously we can see a grant of permission with conditions, a refusal of permission with the reasons outlined, or in some circumstances a request for further information. That is intended to be the exception rather than the norm. Where further information is foreseen, it should be relating to technical matters, potential environmental matters, indeed items that were unforeseen at the time of the LRD opinion when you were going through the final stage of pre-planning cycle, or indeed new matters that are raised through public participation that hadn't come to the attention to the planning authority prior to that point. But looking out very briefly even at those best case scenarios, I won't touch on each one, but ultimately going through the different stages, even with what I would describe as an efficient process for a design team, given the level of detail that is expected, that has become the norm within the strategic housing development process, that pivoting into LRD now and becoming the standard, we can see quite significant timeframes for running through a cycle and as I say, likely at a best case scenario. And when you look at the potential of a worst case scenario where you look at perhaps a further information stage with the planning authority, even perhaps some clarification at appeal stage, where a grant is being secured, it's with the board under assessment and they're seeking some information, where an environmental impact assessment might be a part of that overall process, looking at in excess of 100 weeks as part of the lead-ins towards a final outcome. just moving on then. Very briefly then, earlier in the week, we had an event down in Cork where we were exploring the experiences of the strategic housing process, and indeed that much discussed topic around density and the efficient use of lands. And we looked at a comparison between Cork and the experiences within Dublin. On the left-hand side, looking at the density, the average density across the permitted schemes, those schemes that have commenced and those that have not commenced. And then on the right-hand side, with regard to suburban schemes and the wider settlement area in the context of what has been permitted, commenced and not commenced. And when you start to drill into some of that, very interesting looking at the distribution of the proportion that are falling in within apartments and houses versus student units, and Cork running quite a bit ahead even of its target in terms of student accommodation and what that means to impacts on the wider market. But quite a significant proportion there within Dublin context as far as apartment goes. And then you bring that through to the commencement rate by housing type, again, left-hand side Cork, right-hand side Dublin, as a simple comparator. And we were just touching on the some of the experiences, perhaps a view that the budget measures this year were potentially a missed opportunity. And one study we looked at last year with the CIF and with Cork Chamber was around apartment viability and affordability study focused on the Cork region in that instance. And we outlined, say, nearly some notable recommendations or key interventions to make a meaningful impact on the viability topic. And I would say some of those remain valid as having that tangible, meaningful impact to really see change in bringing forward some of these key developments. But moving on the residential zoned land tax, widely discussed recently and currently up until early January, the draft maps for lands for inclusion in the provisions for the RZLT are on display, and really important one to be mindful of. There are several instances where even my experiences more recently within the firm with some of our tax specialist colleagues alongside ourselves from the urban planning perspective, a lot of discussion and debate around the interpretation and the suitability of certain lands to come forward. So this new tax to activate lands for housing, which are serviced and zoned for residential use, permitted in principle for residential use. So where there's a mixed use dynamic, it's where the residential component is particularly key. Lands will be liable for up to 3% of the market value of the land annually. And the draft maps, as I say, are published for public comment. In terms of those criteria for inclusion in the relevant maps, we see the land zone for residential or a mix of uses. There is that consideration around land that is serviced by roads, footpaths, public lighting, foul drainage, and so on, and lands not affected by physical conditions that prevent development. So where there is an archaeological important or contamination element, and so on, there's some key criteria in that regard. And as far as those exclusions sit, there are a number of criteria there around land that is being actively developed, unless it's unauthorized, where there is perhaps a mix of uses in key consideration. But if it's clearly vacant or idle and residential is permitted in principle, there is those instances where it falls within the leviable land holding, and then lands where the derelict sites levy is payable, and so on. Key dates coming up, obviously 1st of January, as I mentioned, for the draft stage. There is a consultation and appeal period up to the middle of next year, right the way through to when the tax ultimately will fall due in 1st of February 2024 for, I believe, payment by May of that year. Moving on quite quickly then to the urban development zones, and this was something that's being discussed quite significantly recently across some of the development agencies and planning authorities, and indeed across the private sector, but really looking at building on the existing strategic development zone concept, the idea that we can expedite the delivery of development and housing-led development on these lands. There will be likely to be an application process to put forward and propose that certain lands are designated for an urban development zone, and that key element around public engagement to be front-loaded and bring that through to a more efficient process. There is that big focus on infrastructure delivery and what is needed to unlock the delivery of those lands. Specific reference, of course, to the Land Development Agency, the DAC model for designated activity companies, and or development agency to drive these things forward. It's been mooted that there will be a restriction on the sale of lands within an urban development zone, with first refusal being made available to the planning authority or one of these designated agencies. There's some associated CPO powers anticipated. And some of the things it brings is a level of zoning certainty, a piece around limits to the consents and what a planning authority can intervene in the context of limiting the life of planning consents to a 2-year period and so on. And then this piece around land value sharing, which we'll come to now in this next piece. So the other strand currently going through consideration with the urban development zones and so on is that land value sharing, where it's tasked with sharing some of the value uplift lands can receive when rezoned. It has been anticipated that it could be as high as 30%. That is yet to be determined. I understand there are economic consultants going through the finer detail of that. It's not KPMG carrying out that work, but that work is at play. It will ultimately appear as a condition on planning consents. The planning authority will invest that into public infrastructure facilities and enabling development. It can be paid or seen potentially as a transfer of land to the local authority. Probably important to mention that the definition around public infrastructure is particularly broad, or broader than we might traditionally expect, which would be interesting to see how it plays out. The current use value, they're likely to be a register that's maintained by planning authorities, or indeed a national zoned land register. Just moving on quickly, conscious of time, I have 2 or 3 minutes left. So in terms of the sustainable and compact settlement guidelines, these are guidelines that are expected to imminently be put to draft for public consultation. And just on the left-hand side, as it was described in parliamentary questions earlier in the year, seen as a practical and targeted review to update the sustainable residential development guidelines with new sustainable and compact settlement guidelines. And it's this piece really around the debate around density and suitability of certain density in the context of a site's receiving environment, or indeed it's the wider context of the settlement and placemaking in which these proposed schemes might come forward. And the idea that a focus towards more compact, medium to high density delivery, and how we enable that through innovation in design, so that traditional restrictions perhaps or blanket considerations in development management standards, there may be an allowance for some flex for innovative design to bring that through. And ultimately, some of those compact settlement guidelines will feed into a more expansive view around area plans, the decarbonisation agenda, and some of the anticipated mitigation for some of the climate change initiatives. Briefly on the tiered approach to zoning, obviously the National Planning Framework had broken out between service zoned land as a tier 1 and serviceable zoned land in tier 2. And from a tier 1 perspective, is those lands that are capable of coming forward, they have ability to connect to existing services, capacity available into those services, and capable of development, generally within the footprint of or spatially sequential to the settlement in question. On the second piece, the tier 2, the serviceable zone land capable of servicing within the life of the plan, infrastructural assessment should be carried out, aligned with an investment program with outlined costs for that. So we're increasingly seeing that view around the development plan cycle and submissions being made, but how planning authority is considering the suitability of lands to be incorporated, and perhaps the interaction of the Office of the Planning Regulator and others in that cycle. So it's a particularly important piece, I think, around these this approach to zoning. Conscious now, just to wrap up, but with regard to the development plans, local area plans, and HNDA, I think there's one point before I touch on the HNDA around development plan and the prospect of them having a longer life. So moving from a 6-year cycle towards a 10-year cycle, and starting to think of the process of what that might mean to a core strategy, to housing targets, to population, and so on. Probably something that Professor Lyons probably touch on in a few moments. But this idea of how it might start to impact and influence the development plan cycle, its role with census and so on. And similarly with local area plans, you'll see that expanding function of what it is intended to articulate and give certainty to in terms of bringing forward development. My final point basically on this strand is that with regard to HNDA and the cycle it's gone through, and we'll circulate these slides subsequently, but ultimately that the HNDA process, and we've probably done 80 or 85% of these in support of the planning authority process, the HNDA process, and perhaps the controversy around the toolkit and the methodology, there's a huge amount of value and science behind it and the technical approach. Certainly there is experiences around the associated policies or interventions that are being made and the objectives being set out in development plans and what they may mean to the market and to delivery. And I think there's still perhaps some work to be done around how that process, that model, that methodology is framed in terms of policy interventions. I won't touch it, but it's a slide that you can digest when you receive the slides around the future of HNDA and where it could go and how indeed it could be refined. Again, there's a huge amount of value to it, but if they're taken to a more granular level or localized level for master plans or local area consideration can lend itself to huge insights. And then my final point really briefly around public engagement and planning for climate action. The programme for government did set out this commitment towards strengthened public engagement process in the planning system in Ireland. And I think that's something that even within Housing for All in reference to urban development zones, this process of engagement and early engagement. And I think we do need to flip that response around how we can make a meaningful have a meaningful role within the pre-planning process that, you know, a developer or a design team don't need to be weary of, that we can engage with the public, reflect on that and refine our schemes. Perhaps it's a deliverable included in a planning pack, perhaps similar to the UK, and to use that to go on that journey collectively. And then finally on the planning for climate action, we're involved in quite a number of the climate action plans now, and indeed some of the emissions inventory plans, but huge focus now going to be continued to follow through in the statutory plans around green infrastructure and other key points. So it's something that I know is going to have to be core to the radar of viability and how we balance those competing interests and so on. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the future of planning, and I look forward to any Q&A after the next speaker. Thank you for your time.
That's great, Stephen. Thank you very much. A huge amount of information there to deliver in a very short period of time. And I'm sure many of our attendees will have some questions in relation to the points that you've raised, especially in terms of the practical implications of the changes that we're looking at the moment. So if you do have any questions for Stephen, then please make sure that you put them into the comments box before the Q&A at the end, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can before the end of the webinar. I'm very pleased to introduce Associate Professor in Economics, Ronan Lyons, as our next speaker to talk about the housing market insights.
Thank you, Russell, and thanks also to Stephen for a really interesting overview of the current policy landscape and the changes that are underway. As he mentioned, there's quite a bit of change, and what I'm going to try and do is take a slightly longer term look at the housing system in Ireland. Where are we now and where do we want to be in, say, by mid-century, and what does that mean for the kinds of housing, the scale and the mix of housing? Much of what I say, I guess, is going to be thinking about the scale of housing need, but I don't want it to be just a numbers game. I'll finish out with, I think, an important point about the mix of housing, and the two are related. You can't really answer the scale without understanding the mix of housing needs. So I guess I had four key points. The first, Econ 101 still with us all these years later, that the supply is the single most important. For any given level of demand, the supply is the most important determinant of how affordable housing is or is not. And at the moment, supply, in particular of rental homes, is lacking in Ireland. That's the first key point. The second point is that really since the 1990s, we have been way off, and I'm not picking on any particular institution or person, but as a country, we have been way off in conceiving our future. in terms of actually literally as well as metaphorically, the population growth that we have enjoyed over the last generation, with one important exception, which I'll come to. We have typically been far too pessimistic, and that I suspect it's more like Irish officials don't want to be caught being over optimistic. But the flip side is, if you don't allow for strong population growth, you don't then plan for the infrastructure you need to make that make that population growth smooth, and you end up with bottlenecks. So it's not that strong population growth projections are somehow tempting fate. It's rather the other way around. Without those, we end up in a situation where we haven't planned for it. But it's not just a population growth thing. I think the biggest driver of housing need in Ireland is actually headship or household size. So for any given population, how big are the households? And if you think of a population with 4 million people and they're in households of 4, they need 1 million dwellings, and they're going to be mostly family homes. And if the same population of 4 million is in 2-person households, you need twice as many homes for the same population, and the homes need to be almost entirely apartments rather than houses. And that's a high level and stylized version of the journey the country is on, but that has huge implications for the scale and mix of housing we need to deliver. And then the last point I wanted to make is just around the overall scale. We need policy really to catch up with the true housing requirement in the country. So moving on to that first point, I just want to kind of paint the picture of the market at the moment. So I've used figures here from the draft report just because it's the one that I'm most familiar with, and I can do the exact same for sale and rental. It doesn't really matter if you use CSO and RTB figures, you get more or less the same picture. There might be some quarter-to-quarter idiosyncrasies in each of the data sets, but the overall picture is very similar. This is the sales side of the market, and you can see I've a few values for Dublin there. If you do the same picture across the country, the timing is a little bit different outside Dublin, but it's more or less the same. On the right hand side, you can see on the sales side 3 different waves of house price growth. There was the initial recovery in 2013, 2014. There was then a sort of a central bank rules lull, and then there was renewed growth in prices in 2017 and 18 as supply was trying to catch up with demand on the sales side. By the time COVID happened, the market was actually in relative balance. But COVID's changed the dynamic and sort of relaunched price growth. It looks like we're probably going to head into much more modest growth, or possibly even falls next year with rising interest rates. Certainly, that's the experience already in a number of high-income countries. Because we've had the central bank rules we've had, we're slightly less exposed to property price falls. That doesn't mean that they won't happen. But what I want to do is do the exact same picture, but for the rental side. And again, this is just looking at Dublin, but you can see, right, if you go back and forth between the two, right, on the left-hand side there, you'll see sales prices are only just kind of getting back to where they were at the peak. Rental prices, again, on the left-hand side, they passed their peak, their Celtic Tiger peak 6-7 years ago. And there was a COVID pause. But the shortages, since society has reopened in early 2021, there's been an incredible resurgence in rental demand, and there'll be a new rental report out next week. And I'm not going to give away any state secrets, I don't think, but it's not going to show a remarkably different picture. This is a market that is chronically starved of supply, and we can come back to some of the reasons why in a little bit. But that's the key point. What I show on this chart is how many, on the left-hand side, how many sale properties are on the market at any given point in time. On the right-hand side, how many rental properties are on the market at any given point in time. The more, and it doesn't matter the segment, the more properties that are on the market at any given point in time, the less upward pressure or the more downward pressure there is on sale or rental prices. And if you look at the rental market, sorry, the sales market first now, the availability is roughly in line with price stability. There's around 4,000 properties on the market in Dublin at the moment. So that suggests that there shouldn't really be any significant upward pressure, right? Whatever about the demand side and interest rates, just purely in availability, there's more or less enough there. But when you go on the rental side, I stopped that chart in 2021. Since the end of 2021, rental availability has collapsed. This is not that the number of rental properties coming onto the market has collapsed. Right? It has fallen, but it has not collapsed. It's fallen by about 40%, but availability is down from its peak by 95%. For every 20 properties that were on the market 10 years ago, just one is left now. So as of the middle of the year, there were a couple of hundred properties available, sort of off the charts to the left on that right-hand side chart there. And unsurprisingly, there has been really strong upward pressure on rents, on open market rents in the last 18 months or so. And as I say, I won't be giving away any state secrets by saying that picture is likely to continue when the next report comes out next week. Why is that? Well, it comes back to supply. Why are we not building? Supplies is of course, a really good question. Stephen touched on this in his talk. Ultimately, it's about the viability. Right? We may need housing for smaller households in particular. We may need apartments in particular in urban areas. But if it's not viable to build, we won't get them. And the viability challenge, this shows you can almost write off the one-off sector, right? The bottom bar there will chuck along regardless. You can go back to 2010, you can back before, and the one-off sector will just keep churning out a few thousand homes a year. It doesn't matter if there's a boom or a bust. It doesn't matter if the banks are lending or not. That will churn out a couple of thousand homes every year regardless. But the professional sector, if you take away that dark green bar at the bottom, on the left-hand side, the professional construction sector was barely active in early 2015. Right, there was only a few hundred homes completed in that first quarter by the professional sector. And since it grew quite rapidly up to the end of 2019, since then there's been a significant number of disruptions. Obviously, COVID lockdowns. And then there was it might seem like a long time ago now, the evergreen disruption in the supply chains. And that was more symptomatic than causal, but it was a symptom of a supply chain that was struggling to keep up with resurgent global demand. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine added further inflationary and supply chain pressures into the system. So while the trend is upwards, it's really been a hit and miss over the last 2.5 years or so in terms of housing. The annual total this year will certainly be above what it was in the last couple of years. It had kind of got stuck at about 21,000 or so new homes, and it should be well above that this year. But all the mood music, if you look at the commencements, everything is suggesting that next year, because of the inflationary pressures and because of other uncertainties, some of which are domestic, the uncertainty or at least lack of executable development rights in Ireland. That means I think next year's total is probably going to be quite a good bit below what we get this year in 2022. And you can do this going back. Russell mentioned in the introduction, I kind of like long-run housing markets, but my academic research is trying to look over decades, trying to understand what's happened in the last 2-3 decades around the world. This is on the left-hand side, the output of how many new homes are built per household in Ireland since World War II. And you can see that as of the late 2010s, Ireland was building fewer homes than at any point after World War II. That's how bad things had got. In short, my interpretation of that is that if you look at the underlying construction costs, the introduction of Section 23 way back in 1998 supercharged demand. It led to what is effectively a ratchet up in costs. In the space of 3 years, costs increased, the construction costs increased a huge amount, about 70% in the space of 3 years or so, and they never came back down. There was further inflation, some of which came back down after 2007, 2008, but costs remained elevated even when prices didn't. And of course, we know that supply is about price minus cost. It's not to do with the incomes per se. It's if it's viable, then the supply will get built, and that's what happened. I think that's what explains the sheer lack of supply during the 2010s. Those red bars are kind of my estimate of the medium to long-term housing need. We should be building between 2 and 2.5, maybe even slightly higher percent per household, as in for every 100 households, we should be building 2 or 3 new homes a year, and we're down below 1 over the last little while. And the consequence of that, if you look at the blue line there, you can almost see where Dublin was, a cap was put on Dublin's growth, and Dublin here is kind of like a proxy for all the cities in Ireland. It's harder to extract Cork City and Galway City out of the data because the municipality boundaries aren't good, but at least you can take all of County Dublin as a sort of a proxy for Dublin City. And you can see there that after 1975, Dublin has been building fewer homes than the rest of the country. And the extraordinary explosion of supply in the early 2000s was not really that extraordinary in Dublin, or indeed in Cork or Galway cities. It was a phenomenon outside the main cities. And if you break that, say that yellow bar outside Dublin, if you broke that down into different counties and did Leitrim or Longford or Roscommon, it would be well above 7%, it'd be well above 10 or 15% in terms of how many new homes. I think it's Longford managed to build as many homes in 7 or 8 years as there were original households at the start of the period, which gives you a sense of just how much additional supply was built in a place without necessarily long-term need. And as a consequence of Dublin underbuilding, Dublin housing has gone from being no more expensive than the rest of the country to being about twice as expensive. So there's a very clear link in the short run and in the long run between a lack of supply and rising prices or unaffordable housing. And you can see, the last point on the supplies, you can see there, this is the volume of rental listings, right? Not the availability on a given day, but how many rental properties are listed per week. And then you can see that there had been a recovery around COVID, there had been a sort of a false recovery as with lockdown, more properties were put up. But since reopening in early 2021, the number of rental listings has collapsed, and it's not offset by what you might think of as the new build to rent or multi-unit rental stuff. It's that has been trying to really offset some of the decline, but not at the right scale. Okay, so the second point I wanted to talk about is in relation to population projections. And Ireland is due to see, these slides will come through afterwards, so you can kind of look at it. Don't worry about the text. But if you look on the right-hand side there, Ireland is due to see one of the strongest rates of population growth in the EU. It's one of the few countries that's going to see population growth of any scale over the next few decades. And indeed, if you go out to 2080 or 2100, which the more adventurous statisticians in Eurostat will do for you, Ireland is probably slightly closer to Sweden's population growth rate. So if you do this by natural increase in the population, Ireland is by far enjoying the strongest population growth of the births minus deaths. Right, where Sweden and the UK and Switzerland and Norway sort of pull closer to Ireland, is that they have higher net migration rates, or at least projected to have higher net migration rates. So if we look at the natural increase, we don't want to look at births minus deaths for housing need. What we want to look at is the household forming and household exiting age cohort. So if you look, say, at 25 to 34-year-olds and 75 to 84-year-olds, to give a sense of the change in housing need. And you can see there that as we go out to 2040, Ireland needs to add about almost 20,000 homes per year, just because the population is growing. The higher net migration is, the longer that continues. So we've seen significantly higher migration than in the HNDA. The HNDA assumed net migration to Ireland would collapse between 2019 and 2024. The opposite is happening. It's going the other way. Even excluding Ukrainian immigration, it's gone the other way. And that's the next point, is that we've had incredibly conservative assumptions around net migration, again, because I think officials don't want to be seen to be overconfident about the future, but they're missing the point of the population projections. What if we do have strong population growth and we haven't allowed for it in our projections? We are going to have under-provided infrastructure, which I know is a topic that myself and Russell were chatting about before, about the provision of infrastructure to facilitate population growth and indeed growth in the in the housing supply. I won't spend too long on this, but what I want to point out is if you look at the second figure in the chart there, the HNDA assumes that Ireland's population will increase by no more than 926,000. I say no more than because, well, the HNDA wasn't set up to be a ceiling, but effectively it's being implemented as a ceiling by the OPR, that if a local authority puts in stronger population growth than is allowed in the baseline HNDA scenario, the OPR has taken a dim view of any local authority doing so. So the housing policy over the next few years is predicated on population growth 2016 to 2040 being effectively no more than 900,000 people. However, the number right beside it, M1 F2, is the increase in the population if net migration were 30,000 a year on average. Net migration has been 34,000 a year on average over the last 5 years. And in one of those years, Ireland was completely closed. But during the year, basically the year to March 2020, to March 2021, Ireland was effectively closed to migration. So we are well above the HNDA baseline. We are indeed above the high migration scenario. And some of those other numbers to the right of M1, F2 are various scenarios. What would happen if we saw the same increase to 2022 again, out to 2040? What happens if we take sort of the Ukrainian stock of the population and some stay here, or if indeed they boost the birth rate? There are scenarios where Ireland's population would grow by twice what is being set as the ceiling in the HNDA, which I think gets to one of the challenges around housing policy. Another area is around obsolescence. Right? This might seem a funny way to talk about housing need, but if you think about, say, 2 million homes in Ireland, how long does a typical home last? 100 years, 200 years, 300 years? In the HNDA, it is assumed that the typical home, not a newly built home, the typical home will last 500 years on average. And in doing so, it significantly underestimates housing need. So again, it's no problem if the HNDA is seen as a floor. We need no less than, but if it's been seen as a ceiling, we need no more than. We're building in problems for ourselves in the future. And we actually see it already in a generation that is insufficient housing for their needs. So realistically, probably 10 to 15,000 homes needed per year if the typical home lasts about 150 to 200 years. The last one I want to talk about in terms of housing needs before I wrap up is household size. So you can look at this many different ways. Probably the most powerful way, which I don't think I have actually I should have put it in here, is the fraction of 18 to 24-year-olds or 18 to 34-year-olds in Ireland versus other countries living at home with their parents. In Ireland, it is typical for somebody 18 to 34 to be living at home with their parents. I think it's about 65% live at home with their parents. In Sweden or Denmark or Norway, it's the other way around. 65% of young adults live either on their own or with a partner. And we have, this is not a perennial feature of the Irish housing system. This is something that has emerged in the last 10 years. And the last kind of challenge in relation to HNDA is that it assumes the situation we have now is the situation we want and we will keep into the future. That is to me an awful assumption, because it is locking out young adults from having somewhere to live. So it's assuming that black bar there is average household size in Ireland, how many people per household. And it's assuming that 2.75 actually, I think, rises slightly to 2.8 in the HNDA out to 2040, whereas the trend rate is going the other way. All our peers are going down to a household size of about 2. We will be going, even if the housing system doesn't allow us, underneath in the demographics, we will be going there too. As people live longer, get married later, have fewer children, higher separation rates, all of those factors point to falling household size. And as I said at the start, just think of a population of 4 million people divided into households of 4 versus households of 2. Twice as many homes needed. So as we go from roughly household size of 3 down to household size of 2, we need 50% more homes, and the homes need to be for smaller households. They need to be for 1- and 2-person households. And that is not something we're good at because we never had strong population growth. We never had to build them. Because we're not good at it now because of the viability challenge. Stephen mentioned the excellent report that KPMG prepared last year on the viability of apartments in Cork. If you were to do the same exercise in Sligo Town or Carrick Shore or whatever places that need homes for smaller households, the viability challenge would be even greater again. Right? How do you turn a €600,000 two-bedroom apartment into something that can work in wherever it might be, Athlone or Westport? Right, it is simply not possible at the moment, and the government has tried with Croí Cónaithe, but that will only work in certain areas. So, totting everything up, how many homes do we need per year? Right, how quickly does our existing housing stock go obsolete? What's the population going to be by mid-century, and how many persons per household? That's PPH. For me, I've highlighted a couple of numbers there on the right-hand side. I think we shouldn't be assuming that the typical home lasts longer than 200 years. Right? So we want to be on the right-hand side, not the left-hand side. Population growth has been much stronger than the projections. So we really should be thinking around 6.75 million people by mid-century, rather than 6 or 6.25. Right? So I'd say take the middle row, and then we're on the right-hand side. And then really it's about the housing system and what it can deliver. Right? Can it deliver enough housing that allows household size to fall from where it currently is, 2.7, down to 2.4, or even to 2.2 or 2.0. Remember, the peers that we look like in terms of fertility rates, mortality rates, migration rates, they are already down at 2.1 or 2.2 persons per household, and they're falling. Right? So they are decades ahead of us in terms of their housing system. So we need 42 to 62,000 homes per year. That's my takeaway on did I say houses? I meant homes. 42 to 62,000 new homes. That's an important distinction between houses and homes. Okay, so the very last point I wanted to make before closing up is that you may think, oh, this is the guy, he's just coming at numbers, but these are homes for people. Right? And that's exactly the point. These are homes for people. We have been building. We have doubled the share of Ireland's population is smaller now than 60 years ago. Right? We have been extraordinarily successful in capping the growth of Dublin City. What we have not been successful is redistributing, as politicians see fit, jobs everywhere. Right? We've limited the housing and we've redistributed the housing, but we could not. Policymakers could never redistribute the jobs. Right? Jobs aggregate, they cluster in cities. That's true the world over, and we shouldn't pretend that we would do otherwise. So what we ended up with is, you know, if Irish politicians think of Irish people as a bit like salmon, right? They have to go back where they were spawned to go spawning themselves. Right, the single biggest displaced group of salmon are the Dublin salmon, right? We've got Dubliners now as the single biggest group exported from Dublin around the country, in particular to the counties around it, because there has been not been enough housing. So even if you're in this kind of, you have to go back to mummy and daddy, right? That would mean you build more housing in Cork City, Dublin City, Galway City, right? The cities are where it's at. We haven't built enough homes in the last 60 years in the cities, and we need to catch up. The other thing I think is really important is age. Over the next 3-4 decades, not only will population growth be bigger than at any point over the last century, it will also be concentrated in age cohorts that we're not used to seeing strong growth in. Right? It took us about 50 years to add 100,000 people to the over 70 population. And then it took us 5 years to add another 100,000. And it's going to take us 3 years to add another 100,000. But we are going to see a scale of population growth over the age of 70 that is off the charts based on our experience. What's our plan? Are they just going to all live in 3- and 4-bed semi-Ds until they end up in hospital and then they can't go back home? That doesn't seem like a great plan to me. So enough charts, a couple of pictures to finish off, and then we'll have hopefully some time for discussion. As of 2000, you know, we had 3-bed semi-Ds, 4-bed semi-Ds. That was all you lived in. You know, you stayed at home with your parents. You lived in one of these, and then the nursing home, funeral home, and you're done, right? That was the old system. Where we need to be going to is, right, we're still going to need the family home. We're still going to need the funeral home and the nursing home. But we're going to need student accommodation, which Stephen talked about a little bit. We're going to need co-living or options for young adults moving to a new city. We're going to need what you might think of as core urban apartments, what you might think of as pre-family or no family singles and couples. And then we're going to need options for downsizes. People in their late 50s and 60s, after the kids have grown up, where are they going to move to? And don't say, oh, that they don't want to move, right? Actually, when we've built them in Ireland, they have moved, they have downsized. The reason that Irish older people don't downsize is not because they don't like apartments, it's because there's nothing for them to move into. The first photo, the photo there is in Terranure, as you can probably guess. The next one with the swimming pool is not, but that is an independent living complex. So that is I like to think of it as people in their 70s who think they're still in their 60s, right? They do not want golden years, two happy people holding hands over the arch going in, right? They want it to look they want it to look fun, they want stuff happening, and if they need medical supports, there's subtle medical supports in the background. It's a very different fish to assisted living, which is when you're in your 80s, right? And you do need daily medical supports. But integrating housing and healthcare and moving from uniformity to diversity, that's the challenge for the Irish housing system at scale over the next 3-4 decades. So thanks for your time and attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
That's great, Ronan. Thank you very much. Again, a huge amount of information there. And to be honest with you, obviously as a housing professional, probably quite some scary information really in terms of the numbers and the work that obviously as a sector and a country we need to do in order to deliver on those supply needs. So I suppose before we get into maybe some of the more formal questions, and for those of you who want to post a question and haven't yet, please do so for our panelists, and we'll try and get to those. But I suppose in terms of the headline in Ronan's presentation there, which is really supply, 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 I suppose the first question I've got for Stephen is, in terms of our planning system at the moment, do we have a planning system that's able to provide for that level of supply at the moment, in your view?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think certainly the culmination of all that is coming about. So some of the points, okay, the LRD process and timescales associated with it, but as the compact settlement guidelines come through, as the rebalancing or realignment of city and county plans alongside Section 28 national guidance comes in, it has to improve the ability for items to come forward. It's not without significant challenge though when we talk around land value sharing, we talk around some of the other restrictions on sale potentially within significant urban development zones and so on. So it's a multitude of factors that are going to need to be tightened through, and I think we need to continue to look at some of the development management standards, Russell, around this prescriptive blanket approach. And attempts are made in terms of the height guidelines to look at that being context specific and so on, and that needs to be pursued in a broader sense across other development management standards that are based on perhaps historical insight and so on. So some of those reforms, I'm optimistic cautiously, will help.
That's great. I suppose the other point really is around density and the density of developments. Clearly that's been a real sticking point for obviously Dublin's a very low rise city, and obviously there's been a lot of challenges through the SHD process. So I mean, would it be your view that the new LRD process is going to help to maybe overcome some of those in terms of the fact that the local planning teams will be more actively involved in those planning consents going forward?
Yes, I think the first thing I say, like the strategic housing process, which has been widely debated and so on and so forth, and I think what it has done that's positive has the quality of and the depth or granularity of the design has been so significant, and that's going to remain. Like it's raised the bar in terms of the quality of an awful lot of those schemes in terms of public open space, its usability, not just down to units and homes. There's a whole piece there around its integration. From a density perspective, like I had cases in provincial SHDs where the planning authority was statutorily bound by their development plan, which had 17 units to the hectare, where on Bord Pleanála, following national guidance, don't lodge a scheme that's below 35, like the efficient use of land, finite resource, blah blah blah. So that's what I think we'll see a rebalancing. It's not solely the process of SHD towards LRD, but it's around a combination of those factors. So with revised guidance coming forward, enhancement or refinement to the policies and objectives within plans. And yes, the local context of an area planner familiar with the environment, the receiving environment, it has to feed into a more pragmatic stance. But I don't see, a direction towards avoiding the national standard in terms of trying to make sure we have an efficient use of the lands overall.
Yeah, quite right. I absolutely think it's necessary in terms of, certainly in terms of development that we're looking at, and I suppose it's getting people used to a different cityscape, I suppose, in time. It's going to take some time to get there, I should think. We have a question here for Ronan. Ronan, do you think that the residential zone land tax and the land value sharing, how effective do you think the residential zone land tax and land value sharing will be? And I'm sure Stephen probably also has a take on that question.
The devil is in the detail. As in principle, these are strong and obvious measures that you would take to activate land. In practice, we know that the Irish system is not set up for someone to say, well, you know what, let's just introduce a 5% land value tax and be done with it. And all land is going to be taxed at 5% regardless. And that's kind of the purest. Henry George was the original proponent of land value tax, and that was his thing. Just take take a certain amount from all land and then you're done. We're not going to get that. It's going to be a very detailed, intricate system with exemptions, and it's going to apply to this land, not that land. And I think with the residential zone land tax, the key word is serviced, and you're going to have arguments in the courts around is it serviced or not. All this kind of stuff. I think the problem is when it's when the rubber hits the road. It's when you're actually trying to implement these things, trying to take into account all the details, how effective it is. Because there was a derelict site. Was it a charge or a levy or a tax? I can't remember the name. And there was a vacant site levy as well. And whatever way they set it up, it effectively delivered nothing other than identifying that the single biggest holder of vacant sites was the state itself in all its different forms. I don't want to come across as pessimistic. These are the kinds of solutions that I think will help. If I can just throw in one other cautionary note around it, as I say, I'm in favour, but if it's done right, it needs to be done in a way that recognises the current setup of the Irish planning system, and hopefully it will be changing to a more plan-based feedback rather than project-based feedback system. Because if you own a site that you want to develop and you're being hauled off for a judicial review, are you going to be charged the levy? It would seem bizarre to pay something that you want to develop, but you're by the system, not the planning system. In that case, the legal system is preventing you from developing. So I do think it's about how it's implemented. But all of those caveats aside, they're the kinds of measures that I think can have a big impact. Probably not straight away, but over the next 10 to 15 years.
Thank you, Ronan. I suppose the same question to Stephen. I mean, ultimately, my understanding is the whole idea is to try to bring more, certainly for the residential zone land tax, is to bring more residential zone land into use. So do you think that we're going to get the desired effect there?
Yeah, I think I would go back to Ronan's point of the devil being in the detail, and it's this piece around, the land value sharing component alongside Part 5, alongside your existing levy contributions, how that'll all manifest. I think that's going to be the big piece around how that economic methodology plays out. So it's going to be a crucially important element for bringing forward schemes going forward.
Time will tell. Very good. Okay, thank you. Ronan, just a question here for you. So it was reported in the Times this week that the housing market is looking like it's cooling, and largely that's a result of interest rate increases. I've read somewhere else for the UK that a lot of banks have actually factored in their anticipated increases in interest rate costs. So subsequently, the hike in interest rates might not be quite so bad as people are anticipating for mortgages going forward. If there is a levelling off of that, do you think we're going to see a fairly instant rebound effect in terms of the surge in demand around housing and increasing costs again?
Yeah, it's a funny one, because the challenges around delivering social housing and the challenges around delivering rental housing have led people to just assume that the whole system is messed up and working for nobody. But in fact, the owner-occupier segment has recovered quite a bit over the last 5-6 years. The new supply is at a pace roughly in line with the volume that, if you look at the size of the population, how many couples are going to get? Usually couples are going to get a mortgage on a monthly basis, right? You've got to sort of balance those out. And so the owner-occupier segment is in reasonably good health compared to the other two segments, right, which are facing big backlogs of unmet need. And on top of that, we had it's either the joint or the most restrictive, let's say joints, just to be a little bit careful, the joint most restrictive loan to income ceilings until a few weeks ago. Actually, I think it's 1st of January is the new system. So for another couple of weeks, at 3.5 times income. And even when it goes to 4, it's not going to be in any way the kind of an aggressive outlier in Europe in terms of ease of credit conditions. So looking at the existing owner occupiers, I think they're reasonably safe because all of them will have been tested. Anyone over the last 7 years will have been tested with plus 2 percentage points or 200 basis points stress tests, and they will have had a significant amount of equity to start with. That's for, so for tsunami of mortgage arrears, that kind of talk I think is misplaced. On the other side, what volume of new demand is going to come good? And I do think that it's hard to square some of the talk with what we're seeing in the labor market, with income and employment holding up and increasing. That would suggest to me that there's still that volume of people trickling over the line, getting qualified for a mortgage and willing to execute. And the introduction of first homes as a shared equity scheme as well, that also helps. If you're earning as a couple, if you're earning, say, or even as an individual, if you're earning 70 or 75,000 a year or more, which is not everyone at all, but if you're in that kind of range, there's likely to be a new built home that you will be able to afford. The question is it going to align with your preferences? That's a separate question, and we should probably do more to make sure it is, going back to some of the stuff I said. But I don't think Ireland is exposed as some countries in terms of interest rate increases.
Very good. I suppose obviously one of the big issues at the moment obviously is around supply in terms of the fact that there has been delays through the planning process, certainly for high density schemes in and around Dublin. So I suppose my question there for Stephen is, in terms of the revised LRD process, do we think that that's going to avoid more judicial review in the future? Because obviously we've seen an awful lot of that as part of the SHD process.
I think it goes some distance to return a process to the planning authority and the perceived engagement, the ability to engage by third parties throughout the cycle. The fact that it's going through its pre-planning cycle with the planning authority, a decision made by the planning authority and so on, and indeed further information, while exception rather than the norm and so on. The other reforms from a planning and legal perspective, the wider reforms that will come forward, obviously will also help in that regard. And I also think from an environmental perspective and an access to information perspective, it does improve it from how the SHD regime was massively undermined. So in that regard, yes, I see it improving the situation and the extent to which, or the parameters with which, challenges might be taken, ultimately being tightened. But number of pieces still need to fall into place over the next 12 to 18 months.
Good. Well, that's I hope that comes to be true, and obviously we see a lot more in terms of the sort of development that we need in the future. So I think probably the last question I've got here, and I've got for Ronan, and this really I suppose is coming from me in terms of somebody that lives outside of Dublin. So do you think, Ronan, that if we improved Ireland's infrastructure, we would see an increase in the supply of housing? So there's a huge amount of focus on the major conurbations, mostly Dublin and Cork, in terms of development delivery. But obviously, large swathes of the country remain underdeveloped. So do you think an improvement in that infrastructure would assist with that and help us to increase and develop quicker, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, we in retrospect, we put a lot of eggs in the basket of motorways. That we can, if we invest a lot in that kind of transport infrastructure, that will help relocate, in theory, economic activity. But what it often did was just relocate where the workers slept, not where they worked. And I do think some realism is needed on the part of policymakers. They set aggressive targets for Enterprise Ireland and IDA every year about what fraction has to be outside Dublin. And I understand politically why that's the case, but no harm setting the targets. But also let's recognise that Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick are going to be the drivers of population growth and economic growth. But going back to your question about infrastructure, we've had a shock with COVID that probably gave us in 2 weeks 10 years worth of if it hadn't happened, 10 years worth of progress in relation to working from home. Like, I have a friend who's, his institutions, the financial institution, was like, no way anyone's working from home ever. It's just not safe. And then in the space of a week, they had to do an about face. And once you've opened that bottle, you can't close it again, right? Everyone knows you can do it safely from home. So, and that has freed people up. It will be interesting to see where people land on that, or where organizations land on that, large organizations, over the next 2-3 years. Whether they downsize their office space, whether they keep it empty, which is costly, or whether they encourage people, and maybe not Elon Musk style, but encourage them to come back into the office. The other key infrastructure that we don't talk about enough is water. There's a challenge around water infrastructure in Ireland, in part because we're the only country that doesn't pay for, the households don't pay for their water, so the infrastructure investment rather has generally been lacking. And I think, whatever about the micro generation of electricity and all that kind of stuff is really interesting, and I do think we'll be in a different place in 5 years around electricity and the internet. NBI is progressing. Rail is a high profile one, like the alternative to motorways, but I'm not sure we'll see a huge amount of rail. But I think the key one for me as a constraint, that's a surprise constraint, is around water.
Very good, thank you. So I think that concludes our webinar, and a really big thank you to both our guest speakers, Professor Ronan Lyons and Stephen Purcell. Obviously a huge amount of information delivered today. If you want to watch the webinar back, it will be on our YouTube channel. You can also connect with us via LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you to all of you for attending today. I hope you've really got something from today. I certainly have. And again, thank you to our speakers. It's been really good to be able to get some of my questions over, as well as obviously those of our attendees as well today. So thank you all, and goodbye.
Thanks, Russell.